Hi, my name is Bevan Bold, and I'm married to Joshua Bold, and I am one of the team members at AIMS.org. And I am honored to be with you today to teach Module 3, The State of Missions in the World. By now you know that God is a God of mission, and we are people created in his likeness. We're on mission too. We've been entrusted by God to steward his mission. We've been entrusted by God to disciple and to evangelize the nations. We've been given promises of blessing and power to be able to accomplish the mission. We've been given prophecies of fulfillment and celebration that there will, in fact, be every tribe and every tongue gathered around his throne. And why are we doing all of this? It's because he is worthy to receive glory from all of the people groups on the planet. But how are we doing in accomplishing the mission? How are we doing with the task before us to preach the gospel to all the ethne, all the people groups? That's what we'll focus on in this module. My prayer as I teach this is that you will recognize the current state of God's mission worldwide, that you will identify the barriers to reaching the unreached people groups, but that you'll be encouraged with solutions to overcome any barrier, and most of all, that you will commit to focus your missions efforts on those who have no access to the gospel. We're living in an amazing time in history where we can quantify our missions efforts. A website called joshuaproject.net gives us very important data to help us understand people groups. Through joshuaproject.net, we know that in the world today, there are more than 17,000 unique ethnic groups. So what this means is people like the Brahmin of India, the Kurds of Iraq, Arabs of Iraq, the Turks, the Uzbeks of Uzbekistan, the Tajik of Uzbekistan. These are people groups. And in the world today, there are more than 17,000 people groups. Now in the world today, more than 10,000 of these groups do have access to the gospel. They do have access to Christians, missionaries, churches, and Bibles. But that leaves more than 7,000 of the people groups who still have no access. They do not have churches. They do not have missionaries or Bibles or Christian workers who are among them. We have to begin targeting our efforts on these people. We know where the people live. In this map, you can see that the green represent reached people groups, and the red represent unreached people groups, the ones that do not have access. We took this information to a country in Africa, and we were able to research their country through joshuaproject.net. And we discovered that at the time of that training that there were 500 people groups within their country. Now, 90 of those groups were unreached. And so these African believers who were passionate about Jesus but just didn't know where to begin targeting their efforts, well, they realized we can go after these 90 groups. And so they began targeting. And today there are not 90 groups. There are 80 unreached people groups in this African nation because of the data that was able to give them a strategic way to reach the people. We can listen and we can talk about stats and numbers and never be moved to action. But my prayer is that you will be moved, that you'll realize that these numbers represent real people, like this woman. She's a woman from an Ethiopian tribe called the Hamer people. And Jesus desperately wants people from the Hamer tribe to be gathered around his throne. These are real people. They're not just numbers and they're not just stats. There's 7 billion people in the world today, and while there are many people who need Jesus, there are 3 billion people who do not have access. 50,000 people die every day without knowing Jesus. This breaks the heart of God. My prayer is that you'll begin asking God to break your heart with the things that break his heart. So where are these unreached groups located? Well, 83% of the unreached people groups in the world today, that's 5 out of 6 of the unreached groups, are located in the 1040 window. The 1040 window is an imaginary window in between 10 and 40 degrees north of the equator, from West Africa all the way to Japan. And in this region of the world, where there's 83% of the unreached people groups and a low representation of the kingdom, there's also 80% of the poorest of the poor. Not coincidentally, in this place where there's very little demonstration of on earth as it is in heaven are 82% of people with the lowest quality of life. These people are desperate to be introduced to the life-changing, society-transforming restorer of their souls, Jesus Christ. And I believe that God is calling you to be a part of this. In the 1040 window, many times, I don't know about you, but I used to imagine that it was just maybe all Muslims living in the 1040 window, or maybe just all Buddhist people groups, but there are actually 5 major religious groups in the 1040 window. The way you can remember these groups, the way you can remember the ones that you need to be praying for, asking God for, we need to be sending workers to, sending finances to reach these people, is by remembering an acronym, the THUMB. T, these are the tribalist groups living in the 1040 window. H, Hindus living in the 1040 window. U, unreligious people living in the 1040 window. M is for Muslims living in the 1040 window, and B is for the Buddhists. So these are the 5 major religious groups located in the 1040 window, and God has a unique strategy and approach for each of these 5 megaspheres. In Luke 10:27, Jesus is talking to an expert of the law, and he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. But who is our neighbor? I want you to imagine that we're just one big global village. In the village, on one side of a wall, are reached people. These are our neighbors. So these are the committed Christians. These committed Christians, they are committed to Jesus, to his cause, to evangelizing and discipling. That's 10 to 11% of the world population. Our neighbors, also on this side of the wall, are nominal Christians. Now, this makes up 20% of the world population, and these may be people that may not be born again, but they're Christians by name only. And we need to reach these people. We need to reach out to them with the message of Jesus. Our neighbors are non-Christians within reach. These people make up 26 to 27% of the world population, and these are people who need Jesus, but they do have access. They have access to Christians, churches, or Bibles, and these are our neighbors. But our neighbors are also the thumb groups, the tribalists, Hindus, unreligious, Muslims, and Buddhists, and they make up 42% of the world population. 3 billion people who need access to Jesus. These are our neighbors. But there's a wall in between us and them. There are barriers in between us and them. So let me just pose a scenario for you. You have a relative who has died, but that relative has promised you an inheritance. He's left you an inheritance of $3 billion. Now that's your inheritance. It's been promised to you, but every time that you try to get it, there are barriers to getting your inheritance. Does that matter to you? Would you let that affect you? Would you be after your $3 billion inheritance, or are you going to let the barrier just stand in your way? Would you get on a plane? Would you learn a language? Would you sleep in a war-torn area? Would you overcome the barriers? Yeah. I'm going to go over you or under you or around you, but you're not getting in between me and my $3 billion inheritance. Jesus has an inheritance of nations. 3 billion souls are part of his inheritance, and that's part of our inheritance. There are 3 billion souls that Jesus has said, ask of me and I'll give you the nations as your inheritance. We need to be as passionate about these 3 billion souls as we are about $3 billion. Amen? So what are the barriers? We talked about this big barrier in between you and your inheritance, you and the inheritance of Jesus, but what are they? The first barrier that we're up against to reaching those with no access are spiritual barriers. 2 Corinthians 4, verse 4 says, "The God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers so they cannot see the light of the gospel." I've been in South Asia and seen a Hindu priest sitting in a temple, and his eyes are literally blackened. The God of this world has blinded his mind so he cannot see God. I've been in the Middle East and my precious neighbors, and I would try to tell them that Jesus died on the cross for her and for relationship with her, and she refused to hear it. Why? The God of this world had blinded the mind of her. The second barrier that we face in reaching the unreached are socio-political barriers. Legal or social restrictions prohibit the proclamation of the gospel. So this is in places like Afghanistan, where Christians have to practice their faith in secret because they're so afraid of the Taliban, who will arrest them for practicing anything other than Islam. There's a socio-political barrier. A third barrier in reaching the unreached are logistical barriers. So there's a people group in Ethiopia called the Afar people, and they live literally above a magma chamber. They're facing just the ever-present danger of volcanoes, drought. They're called the toughest people on the planet, but how are we going to get the gospel to them? The fourth barrier is cultural. What if we are so different? What if our culture is so different, or theirs is so different from us that we can't understand them and they can't understand our message? We serve a God who can overcome any barriers. There's nothing too difficult for our God. There is no barrier that he cannot penetrate. There's no barrier that he can't overcome. We've been given solutions to the barriers. For spiritual barriers, 2 Corinthians 10, verses 3 and 4 says, "For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds." Hudson Taylor, a great missionary to China, said, "When we work, but when we pray, God works." And so we combat spiritual resistance with spiritual warfare. The solution to socio-political barriers is to develop good work strategies to transform society. For example, in the Middle East, when my husband and I were living there for nearly 5 years, we wanted to get into this political party, a refugee camp, and preach the gospel. But there was socio-political barriers. They're not just welcoming foreigners to come in and begin preaching Jesus. And so we developed a good work strategy. We organized a medical clinic, and we were able to go into that camp and meet the physical needs. But as we did, we could preach the gospel to each and every one of them. A solution to a socio-political barrier is to develop good work strategies. Is there a logistical barrier? Remember the Afar people who live in this volcanic territory. How are they going to get the message of Jesus? Well, we're going to need to mobilize people from their region who have the strength and have the tenacity to go to them. So we mobilize local believers, churches, and resources, just like in Acts chapter 13, where Paul and Barnabas were sent out by the church to begin to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. We can send out Ethiopians who live near the Afar people to go and to preach the gospel and plant churches among them. Is there a cultural barrier? As I said, we lived in Iraq for several years. And during that time, my husband and I, we learned the language, we learned the culture, we did everything to identify with the people. But at the end of the day, they viewed us as other. They would argue with us about religion. But when we led a young Peshmerga to Jesus and he began to preach, he reached exponentially more people than we ever could. Why? The cultural barrier had been eliminated. So we have barriers, but we have solutions to overcome the barriers. If we're going to reach the unreached, and not only those who are near us, we have to focus our priorities in 4 key areas. These are churches who will pray, go, and send to the unreached. Finances designated for unreached people groups. Christian workers who will be sent to the 1040 window. And most of all, a commitment to focus our efforts on those with no access. We've identified that we need churches in order to reach the unreached, and I have good news about the ratio of Christian churches to unreached people groups. In AD 100, there was 1 church for every 12 unreached people groups. In AD 1500, there was 1 church for every 1 unreached people group. That's pretty good, right? But today, We have 1,000 Christian churches for every one unreached people group. Now, we know that all of those churches are not focusing on the ends of the earth, but what would happen if even 10% of these churches would begin to focus their efforts on reaching the unreached? We could finish the Great Commission in our lifetime. I have more good news about Christians to non-believers. In AD 100, the ratio was 1 Christian for every 360 non-believer. In AD 1500, there was 1 Christian for every 85 non-believers. It's getting better, right? Today, there is 1 Christian for every 7 unbelievers. This is really good news. 1 believer for every 7 unbelievers. 1,000 churches to 1. We can finish this if we will. I'm so thankful for the good news, but there are some sobering realities about the way that Christian finances are being spent. For every $100 given to the church, $5 of it goes to cross-cultural ministry and $95 stays within the church. Of that $5 given to cross-cultural ministry, only 5 cents goes to the unreached people groups. But there's good news. According to the U.S. Center for World Missions, the church has 20 times the needed funds to finish the task. And I believe that Christians are beginning to reevaluate their priorities and reallocate their resources so that we can see the Great Commission become the Great Completion. So where are the Christian workers? Jesus told his disciples to go and preach the gospel to all the ethne, right? So why are there still 7,000 unreached people groups? Is no one going to them? Christians are going, but in the world today, 95 to 98% of the Christian workers are in regions of the world who already have access to the gospel. That leaves only 2 to 5% of Christian workers going to the unreached. This has to change. So my question for you is, do you want to help get the gospel to the nations? We can see that the task to reach the remaining unreached people groups is bigger than ourselves, but how exciting that God is actually inviting us to partner with him in this exciting work. So now you understand that there are 7,000 unreached people groups. You know that they live primarily in the 1040 window. You've heard that they receive 0.5% of ministry finances. And you know that 2 to 5% of Christian workers are all that are going to them. But there's good news. The good news is that we have enough churches to do it, 1,000 to 1. We have 20 times the financial resources to accomplish this task. And if we will commit to focus on those who have no access to the gospel and reallocate our resources, then in spite of any obstacles, we can send missionaries from places where they've never been sent to plant churches where there have never been churches planted so that worshipers can be gathered around the throne from every tribe and every tongue. So now it's time to make it personal. In your strategic exercises, I want you to fill out this information. Is there a barrier making it difficult to see the gospel spread to your Acts 1:8 targets? List some of the barriers you face in each area on the chart in your student outline. And number 2, I want you to identify and write down what are some of the solutions to overcome these barriers. List your ideas on the chart in your student outline. By now, you recognize the current state of missions in the world today. You've seen the barriers to reaching unreached people groups, but you know about solutions to overcome the barriers. And I believe that you are people who are going to focus your missions efforts on those who have no access. Now let's get ready for Module 4.